Hello, this is the Committee on BEN, and I'm Patrick Sheldon. Now, there's a lot of talk that China's real estate sector is in a wild speculative bubble and that its banks are shaky. If that's true, and if money around the world is already so loose, what would the effect of a shakeout be on ordinary working people? Philippe, let's start with you.
So that's a big question, and I'll start out by saying that I don't have an information advantage over the next person that reads the newspaper about the state of both the real estate sector and the banking sector in China. But what I would comment is that, I mean, it's clear that they're already, by most measures, the second largest economy in the world, and they have emphasized investment within the GDP. GDP is consumption, investment, government spending. So the investment part of GDP has been a very significant contributor to their growth. And in the process of boosting, so for example, in the real estate sector, China is a huge consumer of raw material, of iron ore, of metals, of a variety of commodities. And in the process of growing as rapidly as they have in the last 15, 20 years, they have brought up the demand and the price for a lot of these commodities. If that growth is now peaking and potentially dropping going forward, it could have an enormous impact on these commodities. And there are second and third order effects. So countries that are large exporters of these commodities are already feeling the pinch associated with that. And that has an impact on their own growth rate and their own ability to create jobs for workers. It has an impact on the United States as well, of course, through the same multiplier effect. The other part of the question, I guess, was about the banks. So there's been talk that China goes through periodic cleansing, if you'd like, of their banking system. So they have an enormous amount of loans which may be non-performing on the books of the banks. And if they're not recognized and they keep growing, the government can maintain these banks. But eventually, they may have to be written off. If that happens, that could have a large impact on those banks' ability to lend and to continue funding the economic growth that China has benefited from. And it has an impact all around the world as well through that. So we need to be cognizant of that. One of the issues in trying to monitor China is that there's a low degree of confidence in the quality of the data that comes out of China. So a number of institutions have tried to rely on other variables to try to measure the level of activity. For example, rather than relying on the GDP numbers that come out, they might try to measure electricity usage or how much iron ore are they importing in order to create the steel which will eventually turn themselves into skyscrapers. They will look at a number of measures of production and consumption of raw material which they can track a little more closely and use those numbers to try to derive whether there's an increase or a decrease in economic activity, and then make implications around money supply and GDP growth. So a large number of economists try to track these numbers, then report that back in the press. And I think it's fair to say most people view that for a variety of reasons, including just economic factor, but also a political process that's changed in China with the new premier, in trying to add better transparency, better governance, and less corruption in the country. It seems to have had a depressing effect on the economy, and that's being reflected in the markets. Not all of the implications of these are easy to trace. I mean, the image of the butterfly batting its wings in Thailand and creating a hurricane somewhere in the Caribbean. So there are second and third order impacts that are difficult to measure. First of all, it's hard to measure the initial conditions that are causing the changes, and then it's hard to figure out what all the implications are. But I think most people would agree that China is going through a period of adjustment away from just pure export and investment growth toward one where there'll be rising wages, more domestic consumption, and that transition is a very difficult one to do for most countries. There's no guarantee that they will succeed, but they're going to give it a valiant effort.
In your opinion, are these decisions or these moves ballsy in any way? I mean, are there lessons that we can learn as Americans from, these decisions that they're making there in China?
Yeah, so I think, I think there are things that we could definitely learn from. I think our problems are a little bit different than the ones that they're trying to address, but their way of addressing it, actually, it's a very interesting question in many regards. So one of them is, you could think of it sort of almost at a political level. So their model of, their sort of top-down model is very different from the one that we have here.
Right.
And some would argue that maybe their model is better than ours. So it's a much more controlled form of capitalism than they have than the one that we operate in. So, and is their model better than ours? So it's a valid question to ask. I still very much am a believer that we have the better model, but there are a lot of countries around the world that are asking that question right now because their rate of growth is so high compared to ours and compared to the West in general. So there are no doubt lessons that we can learn. There are also lessons that maybe we should not learn also in that process.
Well, let me ask you, do you think that new rules in this country limiting the amount of risk and leverage that banks can take reduces the likelihood of another round of bank bailouts? Is that really an answer?
Yeah, so there were a number of ways that we could have addressed the big credit crunch and the banking problems that we had in 08, in 07, 08, 09. And one way that we could have addressed it is to say, well, there's all these bad assets on these bank books. We have a fundamentally capitalist system. Let the banks fail, and rather than give the 785 billion, whatever it was that we gave to these banks to recapitalize them, we could have just started new ones. That would have created an enormous amount of dislocation if we had done that. Would we be in a better spot today or not? That's a hard question to answer. But that could have been one path we could have taken, possibly. We chose to. So do you remember the conversations we had? We were listening, I guess, on C-SPAN. The discussions that they had in Congress. So the idea was, banks are the funnel through which savings and in general capital is allocated to fund businesses. And if you don't have that source of funding, then businesses cannot meet payroll, they cannot purchase raw material to make the goods that they need to sell, they can't pay for their overhead, their rent, et cetera, so they can't operate properly. And if these businesses can't operate properly, they can't hire people, they'll have to fire people, and we'll get into a depression rather than a recession, right? So the argument was, let's fund the banks, let's make sure they operate properly. They'll continue directing capital in the most efficient way that we know of, which is this capitalist banking system, and we'll come out of this recession in a much more rapid fashion. That was sort of the deal we were told. We're not saving the banks because they're good people, we're saving them because they're an essential part, an essential cog in the system to make the system recover. One of the issues that I think a lot of people have with what's happened is that so we funded the banks, but rather than them making a lot of loans, it sure looked like there were a lot of less loans made. Right. And instead of that, they bought a lot of government bonds unleveraged and earned their margins that way. They also paid themselves the largest bonus in history after that.
Right.
So that created a little bit of a sense of...
It feels like there's a larger social question to be answered in a particular way, right?
But I need to just add an important piece, which is that it's not like all the banks were evil when they did that. They also had, the regulators literally went into, their offices and told them, we will raise capital charges here. You will not make this type of loan unless you capitalize them by this amount. You will change your underwriting guidelines. So banks were forced to make a lot of the changes that, a lot of the moves that they made after having been funded. They literally didn't have a choice. But it appeared that maybe more could have been done to try to fund businesses and enhance economic activity than perhaps was done. And so there's a sense that maybe that wasn't entirely fair the way, so we wrote the checks, but then maybe we didn't get quite as much as we thought we would from that recapitalization. Now, to answer your question about whether this diminishing leverage, recapitalizing the banks, changing regulation, is that going to stop us from having another bank bailout? And I don't have a better crystal ball than the next guy. If you look at the way the banking system exists today, the largest banks are actually even larger now than they were in 2008. They do have more capital, and there are a number of activities that they are required to post capital in and maybe can't even do anymore that are arguably perhaps more risky. So it seems like we have in some regards, a sturdier system now than we did in '08. In some other regards, there's more fragility just because the banks are so much larger now. I personally would prefer to see banks be considerably smaller, that there would be less of that, epee of Damocles over our heads. It would be, that if we could make it far less possible, even if, I'm not using the word likely, but just literally possible, far less possible for banks to blow up and for that cost to be imposed again on the rest of society. I think it would be a desirable outcome, and it doesn't appear that regulations are leading us in that direction, regrettably.
Well, let me ask you, was the government right in allowing Lehman, your old firm, to go down?
Oh, wow.
Tough question, I know.
Yeah, it is. So there were so many, there were such enormous costs that came because of that, and they weren't just economic. They were really, a lot of people suffered because of the impact of that. And so there's a lot of ways to address that question. I think a lot of people who've seen what happened. So before you see it, you think, well, these could be the implications. This is what might happen. One benefit that was perceived was that it would eliminate a little bit of the the moral hazard that exists when, if things go great, I get the profit. If things go badly, it's okay, the government will bail me out. So there's a sense now that maybe that's a little bit less of a sure thing. And to the extent that's true, if it is true, then that's probably a good thing for the system. But the cost that we paid to get there was just so high that I don't think anybody wants to ever see us go through that again. Right. And so I'm not saying that we wouldn't want to see a financial institution fail, but we wouldn't want to see it fail in the way it did. So we would want the costs associated with that failure to be spread in a very different way. So for instance, people who lend money to banks should be given fewer cents on the dollar on their money back when they try to get their money back. Maybe shareholders stakeholders in the business should be bearing a very different cost than what actually occurred in 08-09. So I'm not sure if I'm fully answering your question, but there were so many social costs associated with it, so many unintended consequences that I don't think any of us would want to see happen again.
But I wonder too, those consequences, the cost, like who's feeling them? Mm-hmm. And I think that change comes at that kind of cost, mm-hmm. that kind of pain, that kind of upheaval, that we really want to make change. And I think it does reverberate, in that way. Yeah. And so I wonder, when we talk about, it costs so much, like who truly felt, because I know that there was that 90% that was like, you know what I mean? And so for me, when I look at it all, I tend to feel that the price for change, true change, really is unearthing, and it does. We really do feel it.
Sure. Yeah. It ended up being very, very expensive for lots and lots of people, personally, economically, socially. It was just tremendous dislocation that came out of that, and So to go back to the question you asked, I think I would vote, if my vote counted for anything, I would vote for banks just being smaller. So I would vote for us to have a system in which it would be less possible for an institution to fail and to have the impacts that it has, rather than necessarily try to change the system and forecast every possible way that a bank could fail, mm-hmm. and try to stop it from failing. Rather than making that forecast, and that I would rather it to be simply less possible. That would be my vote for what it's worth.
Well, tell us a little about your hedge fund.
The one that we're launching, the socially responsible, or the environmental fund. So we're trying to address, there are 4 failures in the system that, this is sort of our simplistic way of describing what it is we're trying to address. So the first one is the externality that I mentioned a little bit earlier. So if I produce a good and I pollute in the process of producing that good, I keep 100% of the economic benefit of the production, and I get others to pay for that pollution. So that's an economic externality. But there are lots of other externalities. The second one is is actually a legal one. So if I were to go down the street and steal an apple, I'm going to end up in an orange jumpsuit in Rikers Island, right? Whereas if I emit 100 million tons of CO2 in the atmosphere, nobody comes and knocks at my door. Really? So that's another failure in the system. A third one is actually legislative. So if I drill a hole into the ground to extract hydrocarbons, I can get you to pay for that through tax deductions, associated with exploration. Really? And the fourth failure is actually more directly related to the market that I operate in. Let's say you and I were both producing plastic bottles, and you did it in an environmentally conscious way. So you might use solar energy, you might recycle your goods, you might put scrubbers on your chimneys, and I do the opposite. I burn dirty coal, I don't recycle, I pollute the river in the process. There's a very good chance that my cost structure will be lower than yours, my profit margins will be higher than yours, and if we're both public companies, my stock price might be higher than yours. So the market is actually rewarding behavior that potentially could have a very negative impact on the environment, which of course is necessary for business to succeed. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense on that front either. So there's so many failures in the system which are causing this system to essentially careen in the wrong direction. If there was a way for us to change those incentives, so our intent is not to go out and tell people, don't produce good A, you should produce good B. I mean, who am I to say that? But if we could just simply take the externalities associated with pollution externality, the environmental externality associated with the production of the goods that these companies are engaged in, and actually try to internalize them, make them account for that in their production costs, we would actually, not only would we have a positive impact on the environment, but it would actually make the system run a lot better. So even if you were a staunch capitalist, you would be totally in favor for that. Right. You don't have to be a Democrat. I would rather actually keep politics out of it entirely. But it really isn't a political issue. It's there's no plan B, right? There's no other planet to go to. Mm-hmm. And right now we're operating in a way that really doesn't make any sense. So I forget who it was who made that brilliant analogy. If you're cutting down 1 square mile of the rainforest in the Amazon in order to grow soybeans so that you could feed a cow and make 99-cent hamburger, I mean, is that really a smart deal? That we would be destroying this invaluable resource just to make more 99-cent hamburgers? It doesn't seem to be something that a smart dominant species on the planet would be doing, and yet that's what we're doing. And in large measure, it's because of these failures. So what we'd like to do in this fund, in a small way, is to try to have an impact on that, try to internalize that externality. What we're also planning to do is, if we're successful in our effort to short the stock of polluters and use activism to bring down the stock price to a level that we think would reflect that externality, we're also planning to use a portion of those profits to actually clean up some of the messes that are around. And so that's a very exciting part of the business. Part of it is a trading business, part of it is an activist business, and a third one we're in the process of, we're planning to hire environmental engineers to try to find good projects to actually implement.
Sounds really exciting.
It could be fun, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it could be a fun thing to do.
And you've been around how long?
In
terms of starting Apache?
So Apache's been around for a little over 10 years.
Wow.
A little more than 10 years. But we haven't done this sort of work before. So we're very new at this, and we've got a lot to learn from we're getting help from lots and lots of people.
So the activism part is new.
Is relatively new for us. Yeah. So I'm just a dumb option trader. But we think we might be able to use some of our trading experience for that purpose.
I want to bring it back to careers and jobs for the
Yeah.
people that are watching. What would you recommend for somebody who wants to start out right now, given the environment the way it is?
In finance in particular?
In finance, yeah.
Yeah, so I think, so to go back to that division between the sell side and the buy side, I suspect there are more opportunities right now on the buy side than the sell side. Let me take a step back though. If you're starting out, you're 22 years old, you're just coming out of school, maybe you're thinking of going to graduate school, or maybe you're still in college and you're thinking what topics to study. There's so many fascinating fields to get into that are non-finance related, where you could have a terrific impact, you can have glory if that's important for you, you can have a wonderful lifestyle, you could be paid very well, and none of these, I mean, a lot of them are non-finance related. You can work in material science, and there will be enormous discoveries in all likelihood in in the biosciences in the future? Why not work in that field? Or, I mean, there's so many fascinating things to do that are non-finance related. So that's the first sort of fork in the road. I would encourage people to really broaden the net and look at other fields outside of finance. I actually think that if more really, really smart people were coming out of school, went into non-finance related jobs, I think it might probably be better for the country. But I mean, that's my personal opinion.
There's a great trend to what you're I can see this merge of finances with social ideas.
That's right.
There is this great merge. So to your point, yes,
Yeah.
people who have other interests who, because you need those guys.
Correct.
Right?
It's about keeping a moral compass.
Exactly.
Thank you for that. Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. I'm Patrick Sheldon. Thank you for watching BEN, where jobs come first.